I'm Tiana.
And I'm Trav.
And this is I Now Pronounce You,
where we reflect on our experiences and give our opinions.
It can be hard to take the time to process it all.
So we're making the time now.
We welcome you to I Now Pronounce You.
Hey. Hi. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, Lord.
Good to go.
All right, we're excited today to have Harvard Law alum Aaron Thomas join us today. Aaron graduated from Harvard Law in 2002. He's an Atlanta-based lawyer whose practice areas include, but aren't limited to, divorce, child custody, child support. With almost 20 years under his belt, Aaron recently founded Prenups.com, a fair and friendly-based approach to prenuptial and postnuptial agreements. So thank you for joining us today, Aaron. I'm so excited to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes. So we chat about divorce and decision-making processes all the time on the podcast, even though neither of us have ever gone through a divorce. But we obviously know people and we've read articles about it. So this is just a great way for us to fill in some of those gaps that we're unsure about and our audience is unsure about. So I'd like to start with prenups. My perception after, looking into you and getting prepared for this interview has drastically changed about my opinion about prenups. So when you usually hear about them, you associate it with a means of protecting yourself, typically a wealthy male protecting themselves. So education on this just seems really important. Can you tell us what prenuptial agreements are, who needs them, and if you don't have economical means, should you even worry about it?
Yeah. No, good question. And, I'm glad you started by talking about kind of, what your idea of a prenup is, because that's what 95% of people come in, thinking about prenups, and they think of, exactly what you said, basically like a rich, usually man, sometimes an older man trying to keep their money away from some young gold digger wife. I mean,
yes.
For better, for worse. I mean, let's just be real. That's what people come in with, the idea of prenups. And, at its base, a prenup is essentially an agreement that helps you decide how your money is going to be treated, both during and after a marriage. And I think most people only think about that latter part, that it's like, if you get divorced, this is what happens, and don't think about kind of, what leads up to it. So, when I explain, what goes into a prenup, I think of it in really three stages. I think of, what do you have coming in? Like what is each person bringing into the marriage, both, your assets and debts, as well as, kind of your financial habits that you're bringing into the marriage.
That is important to talk about.
Right.
Still struggling on that.
Right. If you're a spender or you're a saver, or if your spouse is, one or the other. Mm-hmm. And then step two is kind of like during the marriage, like, how are you going to set up your bank accounts? What are going to be your practices? Who's going to be the CFO of the relationship? Are you guys, saving for a house? Are you guys going to carry credit card debt? Are you going to pay it off every month? What are your practices? What are your rules during the marriage? And then part three is what I call the contingency plan. So, if somebody dies, if the marriage dissolves, what are you going to have in place? Alimony, how are you going to divide up assets and debts, that kind of thing. And I think a lot of people just think about that third portion, what happens when things go wrong. Exactly. But there's a lot more to a prenup than that.
Well, that makes me feel like we've been winging it.
Exactly.
Because, we try to talk about our spending habits. I know that's always like something that, can cause divorce or can cause tension in relationships, is that financial aspect. So when I was looking at, all that you do, I was like, wow, you really are trying to educate people and, put things into place before the marriage begins.
Yeah. In fact, when I came up with the idea to start, really getting into and focusing on prenups, I had already been doing family law. I've been doing divorces for a decade at that point. And, I didn't set out to be a divorce lawyer, shocker.
That wasn't the plan.
Yeah. When you're 12 years old and you're picking, what you want to do on career day, like nobody's dreaming about being a divorce lawyer. Like I I kind of stumbled into it. And when I realized how bad messy divorces are, I mean, I don't think it's a controversial statement to say a messy divorce is best avoided at all costs.
Yes.
You know, nobody disagrees with me when I say
No,
that.
no, they will not.
And you know, I would, when I started doing, you know, family law, when I started doing divorce work, I would go and tell my family and friends, I was like, don't get married. I was like, just do not get married. I just warned people against marriage itself. I said, you have no idea what you're getting into. You know, I was like, if you want to be in a relationship with somebody, you throw a big party. You can wear a dress, you can invite all your friends. You can throw rice in the air, change your last name if that's your thing.
Were
but
you
do not
scarred that
actually,
much?
I was that scarred about the idea of getting married because I saw how ugly it gets on the other side. And then over time, my views on it evolved, and you know, I started thinking, okay, if I ever get married, how can I avoid all of the stuff that I see my clients going through? And so really my idea on prenups was trying to, you know, can I reverse engineer, you know, a happy relationship for myself by putting things in place to avoid everything that I see my clients going through, right? And so I've been married 5 years now, and thank you. And my wife is also a lawyer.
Oh.
And she'd been married previously. And so, you know, when we met, she was completely on board with my don't ever get married plan.
That's what I was going to say. Did that experience for her like make her be like, no?
Yeah. I think, you know, we were both, I mean, that's part of why I think we got along when we started dating, because we were both completely anti-marriage. And then, you know, we started to, you know, grow closer as a couple and started thinking about, you know, do we want to have a family in the future, and, you know, everything that, you know, goes along with that. And then we thought, okay, how can we do this right? You know, like what would I do? How could I take all my years of experience in divorce law and like, could I craft a prenup that would help us stay married, number one, and number two, if things went wrong, how could I make it as painless as possible? Can we put enough in place to where, you know, a lot of people think about prenups in terms of protecting assets that you have coming into the marriage. But what a lot of people don't think about is avoiding the divorce case itself, which a lot of people don't know. The average divorce case lasts a year and it costs each person $15,000.
Wow.
And that, even if you're not bringing in, you know, even if you're not protecting a bunch of assets that you came into the marriage with, like that process itself is worth avoiding. And, you know, the only person who makes a bunch of money is the divorce lawyers or the lawyers, you know, and it's easy for people to just to spend all that time and money and stress and the impact on children, you know, that a messy divorce has, because the only way you finish your case is either you take it all the way to trial, which is expensive and it takes over a year to get there, or you come to an agreement. And shocker, the kinds of people who are getting divorced, now you got to agree on like what happens to your children and your money. Like, it's an impossible thing to ask these couples to do. But if you can agree on what's fair ahead of time while you're still getting along, while you're still in love with each other, then you can lock in like a fair agreement on the front end and skip that year of spending all your money fighting it out with lawyers. That's
what I was going to ask. So if you have that agreement, you don't have to battle it out through the court system when you're getting a divorce?
Basically, so in a divorce, there's basically four things at play. Okay. There's custody and child support, and then there's dividing your assets and debts and alimony. Now, a prenup can't address custody and child support, so that's still out there. But you can take off the table how you're going to divide your assets and debts and whether or not there's going to be alimony. And that's usually what people spend their money fighting over. I mean, certainly if the other parent is a danger to your children, yeah, you're going to fight that out. But it's, you know, it doesn't make economic sense. I mean, you're not making a bunch of money off of, you know, like the custody case. It's how do you divide up the assets and debts? And, you know, I've had a case where somebody was just like, you know, they've been married 5 years and they were just like, yeah, I want 10 years alimony. And it didn't make any sense. They had their own job. They had, you know, they were going to get their split of the money.
Yeah.
But they were just so angry at their spouse that they were like, nope, I want 10 years of alimony. And they were never going to get it. No judge was ever going to give it to them.
Just to drag the case along.
But they could drag the case out and cost both parties. And they spent probably like 25% of their net worth over a year and a half fighting it out on lawyers, only to get to the same exact result. They ended up splitting their assets 50-50, and she didn't get any alimony, so they ended up in the exact same place. And that's why I was like, okay, if couples like that, if I can convince couples like that to just write down on paper, if anything happens, we're going to split what we got 50-50.
Yes.
And no one's paying anybody alimony, like that would save millions of dollars of attorney's fees, like nationwide.
So why can't you determine custody beforehand? Why can't that be a part of the agreement? Is it because that's a varying thing that always changes? There's so many variables into play.
Yeah. No, you nailed it. It's because what is custody is about what's in the children's best interest, right?
Okay.
And you can agree ahead of time, all right, if anything happens, we're just going to do 50-50 custody, and, we'll have equal time with the kids and that kind of thing. But then, what if somebody loses their mind? What if somebody becomes a criminal? What if somebody picks up a crack habit? Like, you're not going to want to be held to an agreement to share custody when somebody isn't fit to share custody. And so courts always say that you got to decide custody at the time that it happens, because that's the only time when you can decide what's going to be best for the kids.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So we're almost 10 years married. We're coming up on year 8. And like I said before, that financial part, we've gotten so much better, but it still can be a little tense having those conversations. On your website, do you have any type of guides that you can use to kind of talk through those types of situations? Do you need a consultation with you or someone like you to kind of help with those? Where would you start?
Yeah. So, if you go to prenups.com, I do have a guide. I have a free downloadable guide that, we give you. It's called 7 Strategies for a Rock Solid Marriage on the website, and you download it, and it's got a bunch of tips on how to, set your marriage on the right path financially to try to avoid some of these arguments, right? So I think where a lot of people have run into trouble is, we're still using our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation's setup for handling marriage finances. And we just live in a completely different world, right? So my folks got married in the 1960s, all right? And, back then, the average couple got married at like age 21. So they didn't have any assets at that time. They barely had any debt. Student loans weren't crazy like they are today. Credit cards had basically just been invented. Most people didn't have it. They didn't have a 401k. They didn't have a house. There's the average couple back then at age 21.
Yeah.
They may have had one bank account, right?
Mm-hmm.
The average couple today getting married is more likely to be about 28 to 30 when they get married. And that average couple, usually somebody's got a mortgage, probably both parties got a 401k. They probably got 3 or 4 credit cards each. They probably got 3 or 4 bank accounts each. Right. And so, and more importantly than all that, they got like 10 years of living on their own outside their parents' house and built up their own financial habits. And so the way I like to explain it is, whereas the couple in the 1960s, when they're getting married, it was like they were starting a startup company together. From scratch. The couple who gets married today, it's like they're merging 2 fully formed corporations. Right. And you would never do that without like a plan, without some kind of a written strategy, like how are we going to put this together, and what happens if the company doesn't work out, if the merger doesn't work out. And so I've found that, and people in our society, we don't talk about money.
No.
It's rude. It's taboo. You don't ask somebody what they make. You don't ask somebody what their debt is. And we got some shame around money too, right? Like we always think we should be further along, like we front on social media like we got more than we do, and that our student loans and our credit cards are lower than they are, and so people don't talk about it. And then, people get married, and then they're 10 years in, and they're like, oh, wait a minute, why is our tax refund getting garnished by the government? Like, who are these debt collectors calling that?
You see, she put me on blast for that one.
Yes, all of those things. And like we waited about a year before we got a joint account. I don't know why we waited about a year, but it was like, oh, this is great.
It was a pride thing. I thought I could pay everything. And then she just, Travis, wait a minute. Why is the electric bill like 2 months behind? And I was like, I didn't want you to have to worry about any of the, thinking in that old mind frame of wanting to take care of everything. And once we kind of brought the finances together, it got so much better.
Yeah, we tried to do that fair and equal thing. Like, we're going to divide it straight down the middle. I can hold my own, you can hold yours. And it didn't end up working out very well. But once we got that joint account and we saw those transactions come out, it's like, you can itemize on your banking app. So it's like, this is how much money is getting spent on this. This is how much is getting spent on this. And then we had to come up with this agreement of what we think is suitable. And him being, the man that he is, it was just like, well, I go to work, I make money. Why do I have to talk about why I'm spending it? And so, what is like the best way to go about if you have a joint account, what should come out of there? Should you not swipe for anything but bills or, those types of payments? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, no, that is the perfect question. And the suggestion that I give most couples is what it took me years and years of watching people go through divorces to come up with this idea. It's not something like intuitive, right? Okay. And so what I realized is in today's world, not everything, my parents, they had one bank account and everything came out of that one bank account. Everything went in that one bank account, everything came out of that one bank account. And to me, that's a recipe for like arguments because, like in my household, for example, my wife she's going to go out to eat for lunch. I'm more, I can brown bag it. I don't need to like go out. So I see these daily, lunches coming out and I'm like, but then, I got to have the new iPhone every year when it comes out. There's nothing wrong with my old one, but I gotta have the new one. Right. Yeah. And she's fine with keeping hers, until it's falling apart. And so I'm making expenses that she wouldn't agree with. She's making expenses that I wouldn't agree with. And what I found is you got to have a joint bank account, then you got to have your own account, and they got to have their own bank account. You got to have 3, right? And then if you sit down, and you can do it literally in like one day, and you sit down and you decide, what are our expenses that are joint? And let's set all of those things to come up out of the joint bank account. So that's, usually mortgage or rent, utilities, probably like life insurance, you may be on a joint cell phone bill, right? It's not difficult to decide. If we go out and eat a meal together, if we go out on a trip together, travel together, all of those expenses are joint, they come out of the joint bank account. And then, what me and my wife did is we decided, okay, each of us are going to get an allowance. Yes, an allowance from the joint bank account that goes into our separate bank account. So I get an amount, she gets an amount, same amount goes out, to each of those bank accounts. And then I can spend my money on whatever I want to spend it on without any oversight from her. And she can do the same thing. So I can't get mad about her lunches out because I don't even see them, and good. As long as she's not, going over what she's got in her account, like there's no arguments. And we have, on top of that, we have a rule, and I put this in our prenups too. Mm-hmm. We have a rule where any expense over a certain amount, we got to discuss it before it comes out of the joint bank account. Right. So we got a kid, but even for expenses for our kid, like unless it's like, daycare or certain things that we know are going to come out, we'll just talk about it. And it's not about, asking for permission. It's just kind of about that mutual respect of like, hey, if I'm spending money from the joint bank account, that impacts you. So, I'm thinking about getting, these clothes for my daughter, are you cool with that? Yeah, I'm cool, and for some people that may be, if you spend over $100 from the bank account, some people it's $1,000, but for everybody, there's some number where if it's coming out of the joint bank account, you want a heads up.
Exactly.
That money is coming out before it's spent.
I like that aspect of it. So when you said you both get an allowance, you're making it the same amount?
That's what we chose to do.
Okay.
Yeah. And not everybody, in fact, probably more couples will do kind of what I call the outside in arrangement, where you have your separate bank accounts and your paychecks go into your separate bank accounts, and then you pay into the joint bank account money to cover the joint expenses and here's the trick, in proportion with your incomes. Right. So a lot of people will split the joint expenses 50-50. But if one person is making 3 times, if one person's making $10,000 a month and the other person's making $3,000 a month and the joint expenses are $4,000, then that means one person's left with $8,000 after they contribute to the joint. account, and the other person's left with $1,000 after contributing to the joint account. And what I've seen over my years of doing divorce, I could be wrong, but it is my position that two people living in the same household in different socioeconomic classes is a recipe for disaster, for resentment, and for argument.
I definitely can see that. So, we coming towards the end of the year now, we're looking at how we should do our budget for next year. And we're looking at, we purchased a home about 3 years ago, and it's a fixer upper. And so we're, trying to make decisions about how we're going to refinance and do all of these things. And so doing this budget together, I'm glad that we have some of these ideas, to take into that of like, how should we do these types of things? How can we continuously make it better so we're not at that point where we're calling you and we need to go to the courthouse? Because we talk about this all the time. It costs us $60 to get married. We got married at a courthouse, $60. And, if something were to happen, the number one question we get when we threw out that we were interviewing you is people saying like, why is it so costly? And you answered that a little bit earlier about those 4, kind of stages and areas that you have to look at. But I'm always like, it didn't cost us that much to get into this, but so much to get out of it. And so I'm glad you're educating us about that. So I'm an educator. That's what I do. I'm a teacher, and I'm more sensitive to how I parent and raise my children because of what I see and hear. And Travis, what do you do, babe?
I'm an insurance agent.
And so he's always talking about life insurance and, all of these different things that, he needs based on his experience. So are there any like aha moments that you had while going through these divorce cases where you're like, I'm taking this nugget away, other than the financial aspect of it?
Oh yeah. I mean, well, it's hard to get away from the financial aspect of it, but the biggest thing that was a shocker for me, and that is still a shocker for a lot of people who are not versed in divorce law, is the difference between like marital property and separate property, right? Like a lot of people, like what people don't realize is this: the second you get married, every dollar that comes in the door is considered joint property by the court. And so people would come to me and say, okay, I got a paycheck, it goes into my separate account, I've never commingled it, never touched it. I got my 401k, I deposited in it, she never contributed to it, and then they are shocked when they go through a divorce and they're like, what do you mean she wants half of my retirement? What do you mean he wants half of my house? I kept the house. He moved into my house when we got married. I kept it in my name only. I paid the mortgage every single month. And I'm like, it was never like the second you got married and you took your money and paid that first mortgage payment, you have commingled the asset. You have commingled the house, even if it's in your name. The judge doesn't care if it's in your name. It doesn't matter whose name is on a bank account, whose name is on a retirement account, whose name is on the house. So everything, as soon as you get married and you put $1 in it, it's considered a joint, at least partially a joint asset.
So how does that work with like wealth management, for instance, if you have like separate like life insurance policies and you have maybe your mom is a beneficiary and things like that, that would still be considered joint assets in the marriage?
I mean, like life insurance, meaning like if you're the beneficiary?
No, if like another family member is, of course, the beneficiary. Like
okay, yeah. I mean, life insurance is, unless you got like a policy that has a cash walkaway value, is not considered really an asset. So the life insurance, you can put the beneficiaries, as however you want to have them. But I think the general rule is whatever you have when you get married is considered your separate property, and you should walk away with that if you get divorced, if the marriage doesn't work out. But what makes it complicated is, if you've got a 401k and the first time you put, a contribution into it after you get married, now that account it's partly your separate property and it's partly your marital property. But then you get divorced 10 years later, how much of the growth in that account came from the money that you had in there when you got married, and how much of it
interest growth,
so they look at those minuscule details
afterwards, right? And so the default is, if you can't prove that it's your separate property, it's marital. So when people get divorced, the courts start with the assumption that every penny that either of you got is marital money that is up for division. And it's on the person who wants to prove that they're separate property. It's their burden to prove it, right? Imagine trying to find, your bank statements from, if you've been married 15 years, imagine trying to find your bank statements from 15 years ago, your retirement account statements from 15 years ago to prove what you had coming in. Same thing with a house. You've commingled it, you put money in, then you refinanced, and so if somebody owned a house, with $100,000 of equity, they're surprised that, okay, now I got to go pay a forensic accountant to go back through time, and figure out, exactly how much it should be my separate property, how much should be my marital property. And that's why I'm like, you should just come up with, you can agree ahead of time what's going to be yours, what's going to be theirs, what's going to be joint, how it's going to be split. And I try to make it to where it's dummy proof. If marriage doesn't work out, you got a formula. You can just go back to the document, spell it out. Because the alternative is, you can see how messy it gets, right?
Yes.
The alternative is you go and you pay thousands and thousands of dollars to lawyers over the course of a year and a half to hash it out.
I think it's so taboo for some people. Like, they feel like I'm going into a marriage to fail if I'm thinking about all these different aspects. But, like you said, you just don't know sometimes how it will go or what will happen, throughout your years together. And you want to just have this foolproof plan in place as a backup, as just in case. We need to kind of take that stigma away from that. And I hope that a lot of people kind of see that with this interview.
Yeah. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned it just like that, because that is one of the biggest, objections that people have to a prenup is, I feel like I'm getting divorced before we even get started. I feel like I'm planning for my divorce before we even get started. And the analogy that I like to give, and Trevor, you'll like this one, is to me, it is like insurance for your marriage. Like, just because you go get car insurance doesn't mean you're going to go out and start driving recklessly, the next day because you got car insurance, or just because you get life insurance doesn't mean you're planning on dying. You're not going to go out and take up skydiving or, sword fighting just because,
that's a good analogy to think about that.
Right. It's insurance, and the cost of a prenup is a tiny fraction of what the average divorce costs. And so if you can just put it down and know, and it doesn't have to be all about keeping your money from somebody else. My prenup, for example, is just a straight up 50-50, and my wife knows that if anything happens, half of everything we got, goes to her, half goes to me. There's not going to be any fighting about it. There's no argument, and if you're going to be fair, if you're truly going to be fair in a divorce, why not lock yourself into it? If you're going to marry the kind of person who is going to try to leave you penniless if the two of you split up, I'd like to know that. I'd like to know that going in.
So we covered that recently, and I can't think of who it was like a former I think it was like a former NFL or a former NBA player.
Jackson.
They start. Oh yes.
Who was it?
He didn't go through with the wedding, right? Because the prenup wasn't, she didn't agree to the terms of the prenup. But I don't remember if was he saying, whatever we came in with is what we leave with, or was he doing I think that's what it was, right? And she wasn't going for it. So at least before they got married, he kind of got to see who she was, as a person moving forward. So there's so many benefits of doing this type of counseling and this type of talking beforehand, because, we get wrapped up in those feelings and emotions, and we kind of throw caution to the wind.
Yeah. Getting married is, it's about romance, and it's about loving somebody, and it's about wanting to spend your life with somebody, but it's a legal contract. There's a reason you got to go to the courthouse to do it, right? You were doing something that is legal. And so, I just want people to understand that, that it goes both ways. Yes, it's about, your relationship, and there's the emotional side of it, but the same way that you do, kind of premarital counseling that addresses the emotional and the relational side of it. I think it's worth doing some, premarital financial counseling in the form of how are we going to handle our money, going in, what are we bringing in, how are we going to handle during the marriage, and then if things go wrong, can we have something in place that doesn't take 1.5 years of our lives and
Yeah.
10% of our net worth, to fight it out?
We often hear that saying, like, more money, more problems, right? So do you feel like higher grossing couples have less marital issues than, let's say, like lower income couples?
No.
It's all relative.
I mean, look, I haven't seen it. I mean, I think that was one thing when I started doing family law. I started working for a firm where we were representing the athletes and the celebrities. And so we were specifically representing people who were super wealthy.
Mhm.
And, what was shocking to me was, there were people who are multimillionaires, but were still stretched just as thin, living check to check, trying to keep up with the Joneses next door to them, the same way as somebody who's making 20,000,
Okay.
When I started doing family law, it was right around 07, 08. So I was there for the big financial crisis, the real estate crash,
Mhm.
and I saw, people who had, $1 million houses, but had $2 million of debt on them because they had just like over leveraged. And then the value of their home dropped, and here they are, underwater by $1 million, because they got to buy a Birkin bag every month, to keep up with what their neighbors are doing. So
I guess when when you're not planning effectively, if you have all of that money, but your expenses are just as much as you're making,
should have more assets than debts.
yeah, you're really in that same kind of spot. All right, I just have one last question to ask you, which is, how likely is it for people to have a consultation for a divorce and end up changing their mind about it? Like, have you sat down with someone, they're ready to start this procedure, and then they're like, you know what, we're not going to go through with this?
yeah, I mean, maybe more often than you might guess. I mean, I think, a lot of people come into my office, and there's some tip-offs, some people come in and say, well, can I just get a separation, but not a divorce? And usually that's the sign that they may not be ready to go forward with it. And, my approach is, I've never sold anybody a divorce that they didn't want. I know I'm not in the
You don't
job.
want that on your conscience.
Yeah, I'm not in the job of convincing somebody to go through with a divorce. In fact, what I usually tell people is you got to be all in or all out. If you think they're like, you don't file a divorce case to like send a statement or to get the attention of the other person. Like, if there is any hope, if you're still holding on to some hope of saving your marriage, go all in on saving the marriage, and make that last effort, do the marital counseling, talk to the preacher, talk to the family members, like get together and try to work it out. And then if you're done, then you got to be all out and try to get out as quickly as possible for as little cost as possible. But yeah, a fair number of people come to me who are not ready. And I try to let them recognize that they are not ready to go through this process, because, once you file for divorce, it's hard to unring that bell.
Yes, it is. The damage has also been done between the couple that you've taken that step so far.
Right.
Well, can you go through your websites again of where people can find you and your information?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that opportunity. So my law firm, where we do divorce, custody, child support, is at aaronthomaslaw.com. And if you are interested in the idea of a prenup or a postnup, I got a lot of information, videos, the free ebook, like I said, and you can check all that out at prenups.com.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I really enjoyed this conversation. And now that I know that you have so many different areas that you also, practice, I would love to talk about, child custody and things like that as well. It's just so much to dive into.
I'd love to come back. Thanks so much for having me on, guys.
Definitely. Thanks again, Aaron. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure, Aaron.